Hi everyone, this is Dr. Jenkins, and this is going to be our shorter review of the cardiac cycle. So as you know, we have divided the cardiac cycle into these 3 steps. And before I go into them, I want to give you some reminders. So we talked about the cardiac cycle as defined as one complete cycle where all 4 chambers contract and relax. So if your heart at rest is beating 60 times per minute, your heart has gone through 60 cardiac cycles per minute. We also reviewed that the right and left side of a chamber contract at the same time. So while the right atrial wall contracts, so does the left. So the right and left atrial walls contract together, and then the left and right ventricular walls contract together. And then we also reviewed that when one set of chambers is contracting, the other set of chambers is relaxing. So while the atria are contracting, or in systole, the ventricles are relaxing in diastole. When the ventricles are contracting, the atria are relaxing. So those were our beginning reminders. Now let's get to the specific steps themselves. So I'm going to start with atrial systole, and just like I did in class, so we're going to do atrial systole. Just like I did in class, I'm just going to draw a really basic heart that will demonstrate what's going on, and we'll split it into 4 chambers. So before we even start atrial systole, I want to remind you that there's some blood already in the ventricles. So even before we start atrial systole, there is some blood left over in the atria there's some blood in the ventricles because of the previous cardiac cycle. Now, once atrial systole begins, it all starts with the SA node firing, spontaneously depolarizing, and then that nerve impulse spreads to both atria and gets to the AV node. So once that nerve impulse makes its way to both atria, we're going to have atrial systole. Now remember, systole means contraction. So during systole, the ventricular walls during atrial systole, the atrial walls contract. When the atrial walls contract, that means that the volume of the atria in that moment is lowered. When the atrial walls contract, the volume is lowered. And because we know the volume-pressure relationship, when volume goes down, pressure goes up. So during atrial systole, the atrial walls contract, which will lower the volume, which increases the pressure. Once we develop a pressure gradient, where the pressure in the atria is greater than the pressure in the ventricles, now we have a pressure gradient. Get a different color here. We'll do green. Once we have a pressure gradient, whatever remaining blood is left in the atria will move from higher pressure in the atria to lower pressure in the ventricles. So we push the remaining blood from high pressure in the atria to low pressure in the ventricles. Of course, in this phase, the AV valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. And this is a relatively short phase. Good. Now, at the end of atrial systole, once there's no longer atrial wall contraction, the atria will return to their original size. And when the atria return to their original size, get a bigger one here. Once the atria return to their original size, now we have increased the volume, And when volume is higher, pressure is lower. So by relaxing the atrial walls, the volume goes up, the pressure goes down, and we no longer have a pressure gradient. Because we lose that pressure gradient, there's no longer a movement of blood from the atria to the ventricles, and the AV valves will close. All right, now let's talk about step number 2. The first phase of the cardiac cycle was atrial systole. The second step of the cardiac cycle is ventricular systole. This has 2 parts. The first part of ventricular systole is isovolumetric. What this means is that there's going to be no movement of blood and all 4 valves are closed. So we may recall, right, the SA node initiates the nerve impulse through spontaneous depolarization, spreads to both atria, gets to the AV node, gets to the AV bundle, travels down the interventricular septum, reaching the apex of the heart, and then the nerve impulse travels up the Purkinje fibers. Because of the direction of that nerve impulse, because of how that nerve impulse travels, because the nerve impulse gets to the apex or bottom of the heart first, when the ventricular walls begin to contract, only the bottom part of the ventricular walls contract. So we will have a small reduction in volume. So we contract some of the ventricular wall, and we do indeed have some decrease in volume. And when we have some decrease in volume, we do have some increase in pressure. But at first, even though we've increased the pressure a little bit, it's not enough to generate a pressure gradient. So at this point, even though we've begun to contract the ventricular wall, there's no movement of blood and all 4 valves are closed. Okay. Now, before I continue with the second part, I'm going to try and draw in some of the other vessels because we know from the anatomy of the heart, excuse me, let me do blue for the pulmonary artery. We know from our anatomy of the heart and blood flow through the heart that the right ventricle is going to pump out to the pulmonary trunk and then pulmonary arteries. See if I can, we know that the right ventricle is going to pump out to the pulmonary trunk, put that in blue, and the left ventricle is going to pump out to the aorta. Okay, good. This is not drawn to scale. All right, so our first phase of ventricular systole was isovolumetric. We begin to contract the ventricular walls towards the bottom of the heart or apex, and even though we have some change in volume and some increase in pressure, it is not enough to create a pressure gradient. However, as we continue to contract the ventricular walls more and more, we're going to get to the second part of ventricular systole, which is called ventricular ejection. So now that we are able to contract more and more of the ventricular wall, the volume of the ventricles is going to get even lower. So now that we've contracted more of the ventricular walls, now we have a bigger decrease in volume, and a bigger decrease in volume means a bigger increase in pressure. So now we have a pressure gradient. So blood will move from higher pressure in the right ventricle to lower pressure in the pulmonary trunk. The left ventricle, blood will move from higher pressure in the left ventricle to lower pressure in the aorta. We're ejecting the blood from the ventricles. In this phase, the semilunar valves are open and the AV valves are closed. This phase takes a little bit longer than atrial systole. And remember, in this phase, even though we eject most of the blood, or we eject a lot of the blood, we don't eject every single drop of blood. There's a little bit of blood remaining in the ventricles called an end systolic volume, even after pushing the blood out through ventricular ejection. Okay, I'm going to start a new one here. So now we're going to talk about the third phase, which is ventricular diastole. The first two phases are what we talked about as the basic function of the heart to begin with. The atria contract, atrial systole, and the ventricles contract, ventricular systole. Well, it turns out we also have an added step here of the cardiac cycle called ventricular diastole. This is the longest phase, believe it or not. In ventricular diastole, the previously contracted, because when we last left, when we just finished ventricular systole, so remember, during ventricular systole, the ventricular walls contract. So in the first portion of ventricular diastole, we also have a period that is isovolumetric. So at first, the ventricles relax back close to their original position. So in the first part, the ventricle walls relax back to their original position, which means that we increase the volume. And when we increase the volume, we decrease the pressure. In doing so, we lose the pressure gradient between the ventricles and the pulmonary trunk and aorta, which means that the semilunar valves will now close. So in the isovolumetric period, ventricles relax back close to original position. When the ventricles relax back to their original position, we lower the pressure, which means that we no longer have a pressure gradient, and there's a period when all four valves are closed. So there's no movement of blood. All four valves are closed. But then what happens? Now, because the ventricles contracted with such force, they also rebound a lot. Right? So because the ventricles contracted so forcefully, they actually rebound to an even greater volume. Right? The more forcefully something contracts, the greater the rebound. So there's a second period in this cycle in ventricular diastole that we're going to call early filling. And this is when the ventricles rebound so much. The ventricles rebound so much that they become even larger. And that causes a really great increase in volume. So now we've rebounded so much, the volumes have become so big, which means the pressures are now so low. So the ventricles rebound so much that we increase the volume a ton, and then we decrease the pressure. So because of this, the pressure in ventricles drops below the atrial pressure. So by way of the ventricles rebounding so much, which increase the volume so much, which drop the pressure so much, that even before the next cardiac cycle begins, relative to each other, there's a pressure gradient between the atria and ventricles. This is a factor really only of the ventricular pressure dropping so much. We haven't yet contracted the atria during the next cardiac cycle, but simply because the ventricles rebound so much, which increases the volume and drops the pressure so much, we already have a pressure gradient where blood is going to flow from high to low pressure. And this is why we have early filling of the ventricles even before the next cardiac cycle. This is the longest phase. All right, folks, hope this helps. Watch it over and over and over again. Make sure that you know what's happening in each phase. Make sure you know the pressure and volume relationships in each phase between the chambers and or vessels. Make sure you know during each phase what set of valves is open or closed, or maybe they're all closed if it's isovolumetric. All right, good luck.